Hi, this is Andrew Sears. I'm the president of City Vision University, and this is a recording of the talk that I'm going to be giving at the Christian Community Development Association conference in Kansas City in 2021. I'm going to start off and tell a little bit about my journey across social class as a way of kind of framing this. So I grew up poor. One of the first stories that I heard growing up, my brothers told me that there was a season whenever I was like 3 or 4, whenever the only thing our family ate for months was out of a 50-pound bag of oatmeal. And there we were kind of in rural poverty. Most of the life that I remember, pretty much almost all the life that I remember, is urban poverty. So I moved into the hood in Kansas City. The first neighborhood I lived in Kansas City, my brothers told me that it was bad enough that the police wouldn't come. You'd call the police and they would just ignore your calls because they were afraid to come in there. Then I moved to a nicer neighborhood that was still the hood, though. It was Hickman Mills. And in that neighborhood, I remember in second grade feeling like I was the oddball because I wasn't sexually active or using drugs. I just thought that was normal, that everyone in second grade was using drugs and sexually active. My best friend was living with a drug dealer. My other best friend went to jail for robbing a bank in high school. And I just thought that was normal life. In high school, I went to work for Burger King, that was basically a drug house where most of the people there were doing meth, and they were dealing out of that. And my big wake-up call was my girlfriend, whenever I was 17, she got pregnant and had a miscarriage. And I flipped from, partying like a lot of my friends to basically being a workaholic. And so I went to college. I was a complete overachiever, worked, 100-hour work weeks. I remember going to college, and people made fun of me because I was a white guy who talked like I was black. And I learned to talk white, and I, excelled in college, and then made it to MIT. I co-founded a research group, one of the fathers of the internet, and in a 6-year period, I went from working at a drug house that was a Burger King to making the equivalent of now in today's dollars would have been $350 an hour. And I realized as a part of that journey, everyone's class background's complicated. And as I've looked back on this, there were things that gave me access. Even though we grew up relatively poor in the neighborhood that I grew up in, my parents were fundamentalist Christians. So they had me go to a fundamentalist private school, private Christian school. And that had both pros and cons. Living in a crazy neighborhood and then going to a school like that required a lot of processing. Later in life, my parents were educated. I also, at the end of my high school, we moved to the suburbs, and all those things gave me some class access that allowed me, to take this other path. So even though a lot of my cultural upbringing from my neighborhood affected me, there are also other things. So while I was at MIT, and largely what happened is I assimilated across social class, and I kind of lost myself. I just adopted the norms, and that's really the path that almost everyone who comes from a white background, a poor white background, does, is they class assimilate. But part of that journey was my trauma caught up to me, and I had a burnout, and I realized, and along the way, I got married, and part of my story was my wife came from an affluent background. So a big part of my journey has been about class reconciliation. So what happened after that, I decided to go to counseling to deal with the trauma. I got mentored by an African-American pastor who her husband had grown up in the projects. So she helped me understand my own identity, class identity. And I founded a group in 1998 that ultimately became Tech Mission, which was very multiracial, multi-class. And we had about 2/3 of our staff and leadership and board that were Black and Latino. And I believe all of our founding board members came out of CCDA ministries, including Lawndale and Harambe. Rudy Carrasco was one of our board members. But so I had this first stage of burnout, and then, I did this urban ministry. And part of what I did is I realized that, my heart was for doing community development. And we grew to be about $2 million. We were AmeriCorps national grantee. But part of what I realized is I had so identified with the poor that the only people I knew were those that were poor. And there's this, a book that was written, "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded." And I realized that, I was trying to be a bridge builder across social class, but really I was only living on one side of the bridge. And part of what that resulted in is we became too culturally distant from funders. And then that caused the burnout just largely from lack of resources. So since then, I have gone through a lot of what I would describe as class reconciliation, going, if this was my assimilation phase, this was my anger phase, this was a lot of forgiveness. And what we're trying to do at City Vision University is we're trying to be bicultural across social class. And what we did is we walked away from the donor-dependent model because that made it so that we really couldn't be bicultural across social class. And we moved to an earned income model. And so later I'm going to talk about the stages. So I started off unaware of social class. Then around here, I started to become aware. This is what I would call social class identity development. And then here I was going through immersion, kind of angry. And, not that I'm at holiness now, but that's what I'm trying to strive for. There's a lot of forgiveness that happens in this stage. And so that's a quick overview of my journey. And hopefully that'll be helpful to as I talk about social class. Now, one of the biggest challenges about social class is that almost all the language that happens around social class comes out of academia, and academia are inherently at least upper middle class institutions, if not upper class institutions. So the way social class is, it's a combination of an objective definition, and that's what academia tries to define it. So almost all writing and teaching on social class. So if you read 100 books, my guess is 99 out of 100 are going to really use these objective definitions. And so social class is defined by family income or assets or education or job type. But then there's a subjective definition, and that's going to be your level of exposure to group trauma and oppression, your culture, your class culture, and I'll talk more about that later, your status level in community and society, and the class identity of those closest to you, who you identify with. So that's your friends, neighborhood, community, and family. Who are your people? And just recognizing that in almost all the literature out there, they focus on the objective definition rather than subjective definition. And part of it is I don't try to 100% define or over-define class, because I think that if you do that, that creates problems, because a lot of people have very complex class backgrounds, and you can't just simplify it. So what I want to talk about, though, is the 4 factors of class identity. So this is a model that I've developed based on reading, tons of books on social class, and there are a few that cover, different elements of this. But, the first one is your class background. That's your past. That's your class upbringing, childhood friends, family, school, neighborhood, class culture, trauma exposure. And for each of these, there's kind of a goal, so gaining a personal understanding, processing your class background is one of the key things in terms of your forming your own class identity, is understanding that and seeing it through a class-aware lens. Then the next component is class access, and that's current. So that's your current access to power and social capital based on your income and assets, your job type, your education, your appearance, speech, your relational network and cultural fluency, and dominant class culture. And there, I would say our goal in ministry in general is to get people upwardly mobile. We want to increase people's class access as much as possible. Then there's class identification, and that's the class culture of, number one, your community, family, friends, and church. And this is really group defined. So it's not an individual definition. It's defined by who are your people. But it also is your work environment, and the relative part of your work environment is which class groups is your work primarily serving. Is it primarily serving, the upper middle class or the upper class? And then your role in addressing or perpetuating classism. And here the goal is to be as downwardly mobile as possible. And then the last part is class consciousness, and that's the ability to perceive and understand systems of classism, your own class identity, classist culture, class cultural conflicts, and your role, your class role culturally in systems. And there the goal is learning. Now, I've written a paper that goes in much more depth on a lot of these things, and I'll show you how to get to that later. So the other thing about social class, and this helps you understand why most people don't think helpfully about social class. So, and many of you have probably seen things like this. So there's most of the world and most of academia is focused on an individual perspective and an external perspective. And a lot of churches are focused on individual internal perspective. But down here, this dimension is the collective perspective. This is internal, what's happening to you internally, and subjective, what's external. Now, as I mentioned before, most of the definitions of social class are just going to focus on these individual objective measures. So family income, assets, job type, education, maybe health. Then societal. So if you study sociology, then you might get a structural class analysis, or economics, or law, or sociology, or history. If you do the deep dive, you might get the collective external, but you're still within the objective measure. Now, the personal is exposure to personal trauma and your class background. And then cultural is your exposure to group class trauma and oppression, your class culture. So that's your lifestyle, language, dress, food, values, etc. Social capital, class identification of those closest to you, and status level in community and society. Now, what's important is to recognize that there's this objectivist definition of social class that's pervasive in academia. And what they're trying to do is essentially to get everyone to assimilate to that norm. Now, which is problematic on a number of levels. Now, if you wanted to have in each group, cultural group, part of the idea around, if you're going to teach Black history, it should be Black history as African Americans understand it. Now, the problem is around social class. Almost all the books and everything is written by those in the more affluent classes. And but I believe the quadrant that matters the most, if you're going to self-define, is this collective internal. It's this cultural component. So I'm going to focus a lot of my talk on that. So that's what the next part of my talk is about. It's about understanding class as culture and class bias. So for the purposes of most of this talk, and I'll jump out of this a little bit, but for most of this talk, I'm going to use terms dominant class and non-dominant class. Now, I use those for multiple reasons. One, I don't want to use terms that most people are familiar with because I want to kind of break the mold. The second is I want to only have two categories. And part of the reason for that is the tendency towards the imperial middle class. It's a term that's used that basically everyone likes to say that they're middle class. And one of the ways we avoid discussions on social class is that. And some studies show that more than 90% of Americans identify as middle class. And if you have that, basically everyone's saying that they're middle class. So dominant class is what I define as upper middle class and above. Non-dominant class is lower middle class and working class or below. Middle class kind of might depend if someone's right in the exact middle, depend on where more they identify. And my view is let people self-identify based on the four aspects of class identity that I talked about. So now, using that framework, what I want to talk about is understanding class as culture for organizational culture. Now, if you're going through this as a group, you could actually go through and write down you can almost view this like a Myers-Briggs test or something like that. You could write down your preferences in each of these columns, or and you could put an N for the left column and a D for the right column for each of these. So many of you have probably heard of what's called the iron triangle of project management. You can pick one or at most two of these to optimize whenever you're developing something or whenever you're designing something. You can design entirely based on cost, or you can optimize for speed and cost or quality, but you can't do all three. So the question is, if you had to make a decision on average in your life between something that's low cost versus high quality, and I'll use a good example. High quality is getting the iPhone. Low cost might be getting whatever's the most affordable, Android phone or something for you. Then low cost versus speed. Do you ever go to a place that is going to have a long line but is low cost? Or do you always go to places that have short lines? Is kind of an example. Relational versus structured and orderly. Are the rules going to define everything, or are you going to use more of a relational structure? Relational versus efficient. This is one that gets me, even though a lot of these things I self-identify on this side. I am very much about efficiency, partly because my undergraduate education was in engineering. Spontaneous versus detached and objective. This is similar to Myers-Briggs P versus Myers-Briggs J, but it's also this next one's more Myers-Briggs P versus J, also correlated, not entirely. But are you going to be subjective or objective? Are you going to be more emotionally intense or emotionally reserved? Some people just say, the correct way is always being emotionally reserved. Being hierarchical versus being more egalitarian and I put appearance because a lot of dominant class culture organizations appear egalitarian, but they're actually very hierarchical. Trauma is common versus trauma is avoided. Many of my friends who grew up in a high trauma environment, they went to work in high trauma environments because trauma is common for them. They're used to it. They have high tolerance. Do you have a preference in the nonprofit sector for many small organizations versus a few big organizations? Similarly, in nonprofits, many volunteers' time is cheap versus staff time is expensive. Is your organizational model family versus your organizational model business? And I realize a lot of these can be, across the perspective. So this left side is non-dominant class value. You've probably already figured that out. And the right side is dominant class value. Now, part of the reason why these factors are true, because you can have people within a given ethnic group, but this comes out of books on psychology of social class, but part of the reason why this is true is most of these are adaptive criteria if you are in a high stress, high trauma, low resource environment. These are ways that you're going to adapt. So within any ethnic group, a lot of these things, that it's the environment that's going to drive these, but there's other factors that go beyond that. Now, another way of thinking about classist culture, and part of why this is important, is each person, and I have a longer list that you can go through, and you can take this test in an Excel spreadsheet, or it's actually a Google spreadsheet that I'll link to. Part of why this is important is what happens is organizations get full of people who are in one category or the other, and then they have a culture that makes it difficult to bridge into the other culture. And there's actually hundreds of factors that you could talk about. So that becomes a big deal. Now, many of you have seen this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. One of the things I've seen across ministries is that a lot of the ministries that are focused on serving the middle class and above, the dominant classes, are focused on these needs: self-actualization, self-esteem, belongingness, and love, while the non-dominant class needs, so the safety and security and the physiological, what happens is a lot of these dominant class ministries will say, well, these are the spiritual needs and these are the non-spiritual needs. And that's problematic. The reality is, if you have good theology, all of these are spiritual needs. And the question is, what are the most pressing needs? Well, if all your physiological needs are met, then you're going to be focused, higher on this list. So that's just another example of how classist culture can shape things. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about how fundraising drives organizational cultural gentrification. Now, one of the issues is that most resources and giving come from those in the dominant class. So if you're an organization that's driven by donations, so then you're going to have to get a lot of your donations in most cases from the dominant class. So people tend to give to those who match their class culture and values. So also those who are giving, they have often objectivist standards, especially foundations, that create the same bias in organizations as they do in individuals. So, and not that objective standards and objective outcomes aren't important, But if you have an overemphasis on quantitative outcomes, that creates a bias similar to that of the SAT. So the SAT can be a good tool to learn some things, but it also is very well studied that it creates very strong bias. The biggest bias I believe that it creates is across social class, and secondarily it comes across, I would say that it comes through race, largely through social class, but it also comes through race independently of social class. And the same thing happens in funding. So another issue of how class affects things is a lot of Christian organizations are based on individual fundraising. So many Christian missionary organizations rely on individuals doing fundraising for themselves in a ministry through personal relationships. And largely the reason why they do that is because it's highly scalable. Now, the problem is, and this is a well understood problem in these organizations, is those who come from a non-dominant class background or a lower class access and background will not have as much access to social capital. And what happens is it results in almost exclusively only funding individuals with high class access and background. That also creates a strong incentive to be upwardly class identify and assimilate to improve funding potential. So if someone comes from a lower income background, they might intentionally attend a church that is more upper middle class so that can help them in their fundraising. And this classism has strong racial implications. So I would call that class-based racism. And ultimately what this does is this creates a bias that results in what I would call the gentrification of organizational culture, so that those who rise in leadership must match the class culture of donors. Now, that's great. There's a lot of, great things about dominant class values, and I'm not saying that organizations should all have non-dominant class values, but what happens is it can create too much cultural distance from clients, limiting their effectiveness. So you have this organization that runs efficiently like a machine, but the actual machine aspects of the culture makes it culturally hostile to those coming from the cultural background that you're trying to serve. So, drawing this in a diagram, often what we're trying to do is we're trying to be bridge builders. So we have those with resources, those who are funders in our dominant culture, and then for organizations that are serving at-risk communities or under-resourced communities, you have our clients, and we're trying to be bridge builders. And the question is, are you an organization that's culturally close to your clients? Are you culturally close to funders? Or are you in the middle? Now, part of my personal story across social class was whenever I decided to lower class identify, I became too culturally close to clients, and I wasn't this bridge builder. I had a bridge to nowhere, basically, and it was great that I was close to the clients, but I wasn't maximizing our ability to serve the clients because I needed to serve as a bridge. So you can try to assess what's your cultural center across social class. So this next part, I want to talk about the intersection of race, class, and gender. Now, I'm not trying to adopt all the aspects of intersectionality that might come out of critical race theory. Christians can learn from all sorts of theories, sociology, but intersectionality, if you're in our founding dean, he's a white guy married to a black woman. If he doesn't consider both the fact that she's a woman and that she's black in his marriage, he's going to have a hard time in his marriage. And the same thing is true in how we do ministry. So you can have a grid where you have race, class, and gender in the grid. Now, I want to focus this talk largely on the class lens. That's what this talk is about. It's about reconciliation across social class. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying we're going to break this up into the dominant class and non-dominant class for the purposes of this talk. Now, in this talk, I want to talk about some kingdom principles. So the first principle, as you go through and you consider race, class, and gender together, we're called to identify with the oppressed. And, I like to understand oppression in terms of life chances. So what were your life chances given your race, class, gender, and other environmental or group factors? And recognize that we're called to sacrifice for the oppressed. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. What happens is a lot of people just like to identify with the whatever element or elements that they have where they were oppressed, but not recognizing that the world's more complex than that. So, the second principle is that we're all sinners. We must all acknowledge our roles in oppression and have humility and mercy that comes with that. So recognize the limitation of these identity frameworks. So identity frameworks are a tool. They're a useful tool, but if you define the whole world through them, then they become an idol. So, we don't want to only emphasize the characteristics of our identity where we were oppressed. And recognize that all frameworks and perspectives are fallen. They all have, as I put it, sin built into them. They have limitation, including justice frameworks, and they need to be combined with others for better understanding. And part of our fallenness is that, on this perspective of both individual and collective, often the collective becomes much more significant to disadvantaged groups, and recognizing that those factors become the dominant factors that affect their life chances. And we're called to be reconciled to God, ourselves, and others. So now with that, taking these principles, just recognizing that out in the kingdom, you're going to have organizations. You're going to have organizations that have race-centric cultures. So you might have a Black church or, Latino or Latinx church. Or other, so this is a race-centric culture. Then you might have gender-based cultures. So here, a lot of mainline denominations or Christian feminists are much more gender-based cultures. They might be, and part of this, I'm not talking about their stated values. I'm actually talking about who's there and where do they focus their resources. So if you attend a mainline denomination church that is almost all white, upper middle class, but it might have a lot of women in leadership there, I would say by definition that's kind of the definitions I'm using, that's more of a gender-based culture. So part of why this is important, and I want to talk about having a trauma-informed understanding of race, class, and gender. Trauma-informed is recognizing in at-risk communities that a lot of people have a trauma background, and it's important to recognize the significance of group trauma. So that could be racial trauma, that could be gender-based trauma, social class-based trauma. And one of the principles of healing trauma is that group trauma is often best healed in a group with people recovering from similar trauma without a major risk of invalidation or re-triggering. So I helped design our course, and we had a course in trauma and recovery, and myself suffering from PTSD, I've had to deal with my own group trauma. So this is, I've read tons of books on this stuff. So, for example, and this is, in majority culture ministries, many ministries will have separate men's and women's residential recovery programs. So like rescue missions, they're going to put them in separate groups, partly because they don't want to risk, the re-traumatization. So another example is ethnic churches, can be among the best places to heal from racial wounds. And much of the conflict that happens across these different models, a race-centered or class-centered or a gender-centered model, happens because group trauma gets invalidated. So an example of that might be a woman with trauma from men, goes into a co-ed group where it's not safe to discuss her trauma, or someone with racial trauma in a white culture-dominant group with mixed races where some group members deny the legitimacy of their trauma. Or in my case, a white male experiencing social class trauma being told it's not valid because only racial and gender-based trauma are legitimate group trauma. So one great book that was written, this is actually, I think, Christianity Today's book of the year last year by Sheila Wise Rowe, called Healing Racial Trauma. She's a close friend of mine. I served on the board of her organization. I would encourage you, if racial trauma is one of the big issues that you're dealing with, look at that. And that book, what it does is it talks about different forms of racial trauma, and it creates more of a race-centered perspective on trauma that can be healing. Now, part of why this is important, just like there's this project management iron triangle, there's this kind of iron triangle around race, class, and gender. And Christian organizations typically are going to specialize in processing one of these types. And part of the reason for that is, you might have ethnic churches and organizations, and they may not be as effective in, dealing with, so say someone who comes from a poor white background, I had to go to a lower income working class, it was largely white church, and to heal from a lot of my class based trauma. But I was mentored by an African American woman who helped me process that. And then there's gender based trauma, so there's often gender specific groups. And dominant culture organizations often have more resources that are good for healing personal trauma. So each of these can be important. And part of what's important to recognize is that we all have a place in the kingdom, and don't, overly judge these different groups. So, so the group dynamics make it difficult to process all three in the same group, and interpreting, racial ideologies through a trauma-informed perspective helps avoid some of the unhelpful intellectual and political bickering. So if I talked about specific organizations, a lot of these might be rescue missions. And, some of, I have a lot of African-American friends that judge rescue missions because they're coming from more of a class-based perspective. And they have a unique role to play in the kingdom, just like the Black church has, and just like, other groups have. So, coming back to this class-centric, multiracial culture. So, and then you have this dominant class and non-dominant class. So there's a lot of majority culture groups. So these are often multi-ethnic majority culture churches, campus ministries, Christian colleges. Even though often they're multi-ethnic, the dominant group usually is white. This might be global relief organizations too. But often these are, while they might be multi-ethnic, they're usually almost entirely monoclass. They're in a dominant class group. And then you have this group here that's the Salvation Army, rescue missions, Pentecostals, 12-step programs, liberation theology. And all of these organizations are what I would call a non-dominant class-centric culture. And you may think it's weird that I'm lumping these groups together. Like, how would you ever lump together Pentecostals and liberation theology? Well, the biggest difference, I would say they both serve the poor. They both serve the non-dominant classes. But the question is, are they class conscious? So Pentecostals aren't. Pentecostals are focused more on meeting the culture of those that they're serving, whereas liberation theology comes with an ideology. And another question is this organization a charity, or are they funded by those they serve? So Salvation Army and rescue missions are charities. Pentecostals 12-step programs are funded by those they serve. That's going to affect how they serve. So a lot of times these groups and Christian community development organizations, these non-dominant class groups, they get trashed in those in Christian community development circles for not being as racially diverse as maybe some of these other groups. I think that fails to recognize some of the strengths of these organizations. And I have one foot deeply in Christian community development organization and in the Black church. I grew up attending the Black church. I've been in non-white and Black churches for probably at least half my life. But I've also served in rescue missions, and our college, our university came out of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions, and they have a lot of strength. So one is that they serve the poorest the best. So they're most effective at meeting the spiritual needs and immediate physical needs of the poor. They are really good at doing indigenous leadership development of those who are formerly homeless or addicted. If you go to a rescue mission, a lot of people will say, well, look, 80% of the staff are white. But what you don't recognize is that 60% of those staff have been formerly homeless. So charities also are good at transferring resources to those who need it the most. Now, while I like to be based on earned income, as a university, I can't serve the poorest of the poor because I have to, cover my costs through tuition. But some of these rescue missions, they might be serving clients that have severe mental illness that they may never be well, and you are going to need charity in that type of environment. Another advantage of these groups is they're often very effective in addiction recovery and rehabilitation. So Rescue Mission, Salvation Army, 12-step. Then organizationally, a lot of these organizations have deep history and deep ties in churches and social capital. So a lot of rescue missions have been around for 100 years. They're outstanding at fundraising to individuals. They often, Denver Rescue Mission, just for example, I've heard they have a donor list of 600,000 people. They often have very strong administrative and bureaucratic systems. So, the strength of the Salvation Army, a lot of people will trash bureaucracy, but part of the strength of the Salvation Army is its bureaucracy. And then they have a unique culture. So they often create strong community of multiracial staff and clients from the working class and the poor. These organizations can be particularly effective at addressing white poverty. And a lot of these organizations, if you look at what is their core competency, it's just, we're going to love people into God's kingdom. Now, with this next part of, addressing white poverty, a lot of Christian community development association and a lot of my history has been in serving, different ethnic groups in poverty, but a lot of time white poverty gets overlooked. So one thing that's important to recognize in the United States is that the majority of urban poverty, 57.3%, is white. And rural poverty, often the stereotype is, poor white people is all rural. And, there's a reason for that, is that a lot of rural poverty is white. But the reality is, across the United States, the majority of urban poverty is white. And, I grew up poor white in Kansas City. The majority of poverty in Kansas City is white. Now, there's differences about white poverty. The white poverty rate is less. It's significantly less than the black poverty rate. It's just there's more white people, right? The other big difference of white poverty is it's less concentrated. So, and that causes different effects that it has. It's easier for someone from a poor white background to, move into a middle-class neighborhood, and no one will ever know if they, on that. So the other thing that I want to point out is there's a tendency to play race and class against each other. Upper classes have often played class and race against each other. One example is the debate across affirmative action. So there's something called affirmative access and affirmative action. So affirmative action is race-based, affirmative access is class-based. So many conservatives have used class-based arguments as a tool to reverse affirmative action and limit policies addressing racism. That's caused a lot of individuals and racial groups to be hostile to discussions on class and to not address classism, because they've seen and they realize this is a tactic that's used. But there's social reasons to consider both affirmative access and affirmative action. And if you ask people, what portion of folks are, basically the point of these two charts here is that if we're going to just go off of, what people really believe in, it would make sense to have both affirmative action and affirmative access. So have a race-based and class-based. Now, the problem is that a lot of conservatives are trying to get us to switch to affirmative access rather than affirmative action, but they're both significant. Now, there's also a class bias of funders for large nonprofits that creates racial bias. So this is an amazing organization called Race to Lead. And it's talked about the lack of diversity in nonprofit organizational leadership. Now, what's significant about this is if you look at what portion of leadership is led by people of color, there's a much higher percentage of nonprofit organizations that are less than $1 million that are led by people of color than organizations that have more than $5 million. And what happens among foundations is foundations have a strong bias towards the big, towards the objective, towards those that can produce these highly quantitative outcomes that are very expensive to maintain, but also distort the organization's culture in a way that often makes the organization more distant from clients. And that is, what I'm talking about, this gentrification of culture that happens. But the net result of that also is that this class bias towards large organizations creates a racial bias. Now, the same thing is true across gender, where there's a class bias of funders for large nonprofits that creates a gender bias. So a lot of you have heard about how there's a strong gender bias in nonprofits, but the reality is if you go to nonprofits that have less than $250,000 in their budget, the majority of those are led by women. Now, once you get to above 10 million, then all of a sudden that drops to 29% in 2013. And part of the reason for this, as I said before, you have this funding bias, and people want to fund those that are like themselves, and that often results in having class values similar, but it also could have gender or race. So this can all be discouraging. You can feel like, okay, well, what do I do with all this? So let me talk about what we can do individually and as a group. So number one, what you can do. So I have a paper on reconciliation on social class, and I go into more in depth on this. You can grow in your own social identity development process across race, class, and gender. And this is borrowing from the racial identity development process and simplifying it. And a lot of the same concepts apply across class. So I'll talk mostly about this. So in my own journey, I wasn't aware of social class. Then I became aware, but a lot of it was on a head level. I hadn't processed it. And so you could become growing awareness of culture and racism, classism, sexism, but most processing is on a head level. Part of the whole idea behind CCDA of relocation is that you're going to do immersion. You can only really get heart level learning is if you immerse and identify with whatever this group is. So that could be across race, class, or gender, and you're going to process on an emotional level and heal from the effects of racism, classism, sexism through action, relationships, and forgiveness. And then what we're trying to do is to get to holiness, where you have head, heart, and hand, all mastery of those, and you have secure, consistent racial and social identity while integrating the strengths from other cultures, and continue reconciliation by addressing social injustice, bringing social healing, and addressing personal cultural brokenness. So for me to get from this was my angry phase, and this is where the only people I knew were people who were poor. And as I forgave, I was able to move more into this and to be a better bridge. So that's number one, go through a social identity development process. Number two is to know your personal cross-cultural sphere of influence. So this is my personal cross-cultural sphere of influence, and you could have concentric circles. Okay, the groups that I feel most comfortable with, white and black working class. This is the neighborhood I grew up in. This is most of who I've worked with for the majority of my life. And I feel largely, equally comfortable in white and black working class. And then tier two, I'm also very comfortable, working with people from a poor white background, a middle class background. And for the purpose of this diagram, I'm being more granular than just dominant, non-dominant class. And then second generation, Latina, or Asian American working class. And then my personal third tier is people who are international, middle class from another language, someone who's African American who comes from poor or middle class, first generation or poor or middle class Latino or Asian, and then upper middle class women. These are all groups that I work with a lot. I can do reasonably well, but I am honestly not as good. My sweet spot in management is these first two tiers, and my sweet spot in relating. This stretches me more culturally. And then there's groups that are out here, and there's probably groups that I didn't name, right? But a lot of other people beyond this is largely beyond my cross-cultural limit to work effectively. Now, one thing that's really important, some of you have read John Maxwell. He has a ton of books on leadership. Probably his most famous law of leadership is called the law of the lid. And the idea is if your leadership level is an 8, then your effectiveness can never be greater than a 7, because you can only effectively lead those at a 7 or below. So what's important about that is cross-culturally how that plays out in an organization. So, your leadership level will vary across different cross-cultural groups. So someone who's a level 8 leader with white middle-class men might be a 5 with black upper middle-class women. And each person will have different cross-cultural sphere of influence or leadership levels across various groups, given their cultural background and identity. Now, how the cross-cultural law of the lid plays out organizationally is you have an organization, you might have a white male upper middle class leader, and then if you were to do this, so interacting with white middle class or white, he might be a level 8, but then Asian, black, Latina would be 4, and then across every time he's supervising someone across gender or class, you're going to reduce 1. So what that means is he's able to supervise a very strong leader that's white, male, upper middle class, level 7 leader. And then that person's able to supervise 15 largely upper middle class staff. But then he supervises someone who is white female, not as strong as a leader, someone who's black, leader, and then ultimately what happens across this is you end up having not as many, working class people across this diagram. So the result is you're creating a class bias. So the same thing could happen across gender or across race. But the reality is, from what I've seen, and I've worked with hundreds of organizations, very close with them, from what I've seen, the dominant way bias happens in an organization and just who is serving in the organization is from this. It's because whoever's at the top is not able to lead people as effectively across different cultural groups. And what that does is that results in this 4th area. So knowing your organizational cross-cultural sphere of influence. So this is the cross-cultural sphere of influence for City Vision University. So historically, City Vision University grew out of the Association of Gospel Rescue Mission, which is an evangelical group. So evangelical serving the poor now, a lot of people aren't using that term anymore. So whatever you want to call it, evangelical or Bible-believing people serving the poor, largely adult, white and black, working class. So people who come from that background, they have an amazing, absolutely amazing experience. Tier 2, these groups also have a really good experience. So Christians and nonprofit professionals, especially if they come from a working class background, and our students right now are about 50% white, 25% black. These are the groups that we serve the best. So those who are leaders in Christian nonprofit professions, and then participants, so graduates of a lot of these programs. So these rescue missions that graduate, serving the homeless. So a lot of we do well in serving that community. But then we have the 3rd tier. Often we get non-Christians who are just coming to us seeking affordable degrees. And then we get Christians who just seek affordable degrees. And then we haven't done as well in serving Asian and Latina Christians. And we're trying to do that. So part of what we've done is we've identified our cross-cultural sphere of influence, and we're trying to stretch this as much as possible. And this is international students, but there's others that are just beyond our cross-cultural sphere of influence. And we recognize that there's this systemic issues that happen in how this gets played out, and we try to stretch as far as we can, but we also recognize some of our limits. So that's the 3rd domain, and we try to do things strategically for that. So the next one is across social class and the poor, is recognizing the strengths of different traditions and partnering. So using that grid that I showed before of individual and collective and internal and external, you have groups that are focused on, this is the evangelical tradition. So change is brought by personal salvation. That's very accessible to the poor. And then there's the strength of the charity tradition, where the poor need physical needs met while spiritual needs are being met. So a lot of rescue missions and Salvation Army and a lot of organizations will cover these two well. So this is really the Christian charity model, covering these quadrants, but it's largely individual. Then you have the charismatic tradition, which is one of the groups that, the poor often choose the head or the heart over the head, and they value churches and worship styles that fit their culture over cognitive, ideological, or political stances. So, this is, I've heard people say that the Marxist in Latin America chose the poor, but the poor chose the Pentecostals. And the reason for that is because the Marxists often are, in this quadrant over here, and the poor care about the cultural side. So then you have the social justice tradition, and there the poor are deeply affected by unjust systems, but are often not able to affect political change as much as those with resources. So there's a lot of upper middle class churches, a lot of mainline denominations, and a key role for Christians in the dominant class is for advocacy and social change. So just recognizing, so if you're a charity, you may not be able to do all four quadrants, but how do you partner with these and how do you not judge these, right? Because what happens is we judge and we say, okay, these are the, some of the rescue missions are concerned, are we going to become Marxist if we partner with this group that's trying to get social change changed? Well, the question is, are they advocating for policies that your people need, right? So, and that gets into this next thing, is this macro trends that are distorting the culture of Christian community development ministry. So whenever I started attending CCDA about 20 years ago, CCDA and most Christian community development organizations were really right at the center here. They were, half between grassroots and the affluent and elite. They're half between the left and the right. And they were balanced. They were middle class, maybe working class, mid-size, and moderate. But what's happened is over the past 20 years, there's been these huge trends for political polarization, and then there's been this wealth concentration. So political polarizations to the left and right, and the wealth concentration is to go up, and the decline of the middle class. So what's happened is we've moved to these Christian community development organizations that are, on the far left, and they've become much more affluent. And then on the far right, and they've become much more affluent. And so, as I mentioned, we've worked with hundreds of organizations from our AmeriCorps program to partners with our university. And we've seen over half of those close in the past 10 years. I think the next 10 years, another half is going to close. So because of this wealth concentration. So it's basically you either, class assimilate or you are going to die. So, but the goal is to grow bigger and professionalize without compromising culture. And in many ways, I would say that is the central goal of what City Vision University is about. Now, this group over here, I would say about 20 to 30% over the next decade or two, they're going to become very ineffective because they're going to become increasingly conservative, racially and socially isolated, and they're going to become culturally gentrified. This group here, I would say 40 to 60% are going to secularize. This group is at high risk for secularizing. So that would be like becoming more like the YMCA or culturally gentrifying. So ultimately, that's what we're about as an organization, is how do we keep these negative outcomes from happening and have the positive outcomes? How do we help organizations become, expand their sphere of influence so that they can reach those with resources better and stay closer to those, in the grassroots, and, have people in their community that are more, a little bit to the left of center and a little bit to the right of center, and keep them all, a part of their larger movement. That's a lot of what we're trying to do is to bring them together. So if you're interested in growing more in this, so the recording and slides and links from this talk is on our website, cityvisioninstitute.org. That's the free website that corresponds to City Vision University. And you can look at the links and recordings. We also have the social class questionnaire on here and a lot of other resources that you can do. And full courses like our cross-cultural management and ministry course, our leadership and under-resourced community, and our Christian community development course. So hopefully you find these helpful, and please share this resource with others. Thanks a lot.